Hello everyone. In this video I want to discuss Izaak Walton's Compleat Angler. A word about Izaak Walton's biography. He was born in 1593 and lived until 1683, so you can see he lived an enormously long life for those days, 90 years. He was born in Staffordshire, eventually went to London, became apprenticed of a drapier, and became a drapier himself, made a very good living at it through his life. But his heart really was in matters religious and had a kind of scholarly bent. And so he cultivated friends in those areas, and so Sir Henry Wotton approached him at some point and asked him to collect materials for a life that Wotton wanted to write about John Donne. However, Wotton died in 1639, and so Walton himself wrote this life of John Donne and published it in 1640. You have a copy of his life of John Donne in your green tome. He seemed to enjoy the process of writing biography, and so he wrote biographies of several more English churchmen, including Henry Wotton himself, but also wrote about John Donne's good friend George Herbert, and you have selections from that as well in your volume for this course. He, in 1653, wrote his masterwork, The Compleat Angler, and it's about the Compleat Angler that I wish to talk today. The Compleat Angler is the classic work on fishing. There are plenty of other works on fishing, but this is one of the first, and no doubt the greatest in the English language for reasons that I wish to discuss today. It's first of all, it's a guide to trout fishing. That much, though obvious, must be said. It is a book about fishing, particularly how to fish for trout, and to that extent it is a manual. However, in addition to being just a strict how-to manual, and in fact there are plenty of passages in which Walton talks about methods of fishing. It is cast primarily as a narrative. It tells a story along the way, beginning with a conversation between three acquaintances and then ending with a growing friendship between two of those acquaintances. And in this way, Walton employs what the ancient Roman poet Horace, in his work The Ars Poetica, entitles utile dulci, or sweet usefulness, to take that, as Horace says, every work of literature, particularly every poem, should be useful, it should be instructive, but it should also be pleasant to read. And this is a idea, this Horatian ideal. This is an idea that Walton himself in the introduction endorses, and it's a sort of universally accepted up through perhaps the Romantic period, or maybe even later than that, the early 20th century. It's a perfectly fine example of this may be seen, for instance, and a simple example may be seen, for instance, in Christ's parables, where Jesus will try to instill a message, but he'll do so by telling a narrative which appeals to the imagination and remains in the memory. So by making his teaching interesting, it's more accessible both at the moment and later on to the reader or to the listener. And so Walton is availing himself of that ancient Horatian advice. It is a devoutly Christian work as well. That's probably the second hallmark of this work, that it is a devoutly Christian work, as one sees at every place in the Compleat Angler, on almost every page, from those early passages where Auceps, Venator, and Piscator talk about scriptural authority for their activities, to the very end when when the Piscator is talking to his friend Venator about how to conduct oneself as a Christian and how to live responsibly in regard to others and so on. So it's a thoroughly Christian work, as one would expect from someone of Walton's inclinations. In addition to being Christian, however, we can say it's a Christian humanist work in that it also draws heavily on the classical tradition of ancient Greece and Rome. Primarily, it draws on the ancient pastoral tradition. We've talked about this before. The pastoral is a version of the classical developed late in Greek literature. It's a form of literature that is set in the countryside, particularly, as its name pastoral indicates, among shepherds who are, while they feed their flocks, are passing the time by singing to one another about various topics. And the same thing is true here in the Compleat Angler, where towards the end, of course, we get the two of the most famous pastoral poems in the English language, the passionate shepherd to his love and the nymph's reply. But it's a poem that the entire work sings the praises of the countryside, the beauties of the countryside, and how wonderful a life lived in the countryside can be. And then finally, one might say, another quality that one finds in every paragraph, essentially, is that it's a very good-natured, sweet-tempered work. It everywhere emphasizes what we might call concordia discourse, that is, the coming together of disparate elements, and those elements working together and producing something new and wonderful. We see this in the friendship formed between Piscator and Venator, who at first have very different points of view, but over the course of the work become good friends. We see this in the sheer love of nature. Nature is all about the blending of different elements. In this work, it's about the human entering into the world of nature. It's about different types of nature, the rivers and the streams and the fields and the sheep and so on, that come together to produce one magnificent tableau. It's one might say that this concordia discourse, this coming together of different elements, is absolutely sort of the fundamental basis of civil society. It's the fundamental basis of life in a family. It's the fundamental basis of religious life. It's the hallmark of nature herself, and so on. And so it's celebrating this concordia discourse, we find that Walton is really reflecting nature at its finest and best. What I'd like to do now is go through the work section by section. There are 5 chapters, and before that an introduction. So if we turn to the introduction, we will see that the tone is set already as early as the second paragraph. Well, I might actually look at the little header that comes right before the epistle, right after the title, the Epistle to the Reader, to all readers of this discourse, but especially the honest angler. First of all, a couple of words about vocabulary. Angler, because the fishhook presumably makes an angle. So angler is the preferred term for fishing that Izaak Walton uses. In our day, I suppose, in contemporary English, it's much, particularly in America, we tend to use the term fishing much more commonly than angling, which is preferred perhaps more in England. So there is that. Also the emphasis on discourse for 2 reasons. One is that it is a discourse in that he is going to be writing about, or he's going to be using language to discuss and to describe an activity. There's discourse for you. But also, as we mentioned before, the concordia discourse, discourse being a coming together, also a coming together in conversation, a coming together of elements that are originally somewhat opposed, as we will find here in chapter 1. So there is that. Also is in the second paragraph, and though this discourse may be liable to some exceptions, yet I cannot doubt but that most readers may receive so much pleasure or profit by it as may make it worthy of their perusal, if they be not very busy men. So there is the emphasis at the end of that sentence on the fact that it is pleasant sometimes to be not very busy, to have free time, and that one can use this free time, according to Walton. One of the best ways to use it for pleasure and profit is to go out into nature and enjoy the beauties of the countryside. But even more than that, that phrase pleasure or profit, there is Horace's utile dulci, the usefulness and sweetness, pleasure or profit together. And that if those two are bound up, then there's every reason to read this work, because it will be a pleasant thing to do, but it will also improve the mind. It will impart a skill, or help impart a skill, that of angling, and provide much ancillary knowledge along the way. As he says, I have in several places mixed, not with any scurrility, but some innocent, harmless mirth, which, if thou be a severe, sour-complexioned man, you may not be the best judge of this work, but this work does contain much pleasantness. It will afford much joy to the reading. And he goes on to mention the fact that when it was published in the 17th century, it was published with some very nice woodcuts, which is why he says in that short paragraph near the top of the left column on page 224, next let me add this, that he that likes not the book should at least like the excellent picture of the trout and some other fish. So it has, again, part of the sweetness and pleasure that is afforded by this book is the illustrations that come with it. And then immediately goes on to talk about the useful part of this discourse and defends himself at this point, because one of the great challenges that he sets himself in this work, obviously, is that he is trying to write. He is trying to use language to impart a practical skill, that of fishing for trout in a stream. And he realizes this is open to some objection. Of course, the best way to impart this skill is to do so by example and by practice, not by talking about. And this is why he mentions that this other book by Mr. Hales, who is a very fine fencer, master in the use of the sword, wrote a book about fencing, and people ridiculed it because you can't learn fencing by reading a book. Even so, you can't really learn trout fishing by reading about it, and yet you can learn some things about trout fishing by reading about it. You can gain some knowledge about it, and so he defends his work on that grounds. We can learn some things about fishing by reading this work. And it's at this point, and that's why, at the end of this introduction of this epistle to the reader. And I might add here, too, that the very fact that he begins the work with an epistle to the reader is in itself significant. We have the author and the reader. We're not to conceive of them as wholly separate in the sense that they're sort of oppositional forces, but once again, we have two different people, two different minds coming together by means of an epistle. And so we have in chapter 1, we have the beginning of this conversation or beginning of this dialogue, these three wanderers happen upon one another. They happen to be walking in the same direction, and so they decide to pass the time by engaging in this discourse. Now, the fact that this work is described or cast as kind of dialogue is absolutely important here. The fact that it's a conversation, once again, emphasizes the kind of sweetness of this work. Conversation between people, meeting of the minds. There is no ultimate opposition here, that what we have in this work are people coming together. If there are any oppositions, they're oppositions to be overcome so that people can enjoy one another's company So there is so that's a perfect reason why this work is cast as a dialogue, but there are others as well. The dialogue is an ancient form, and it's an ancient, believe it or not, an ancient philosophical form. And we're back again to this matter that the work is not just pleasant, but that it's also useful. This work does engage in philosophy in various places. I think particular, for instance, about that passage in which he speculates about whether or not the contemplative life or the practical life is the better one. An ancient debate in philosophy. The dialogue, as I say, is an ancient philosophical form. Plato, one of the first extensive philosophical writer in ancient Greece, at the very beginning of the tradition, writes his works as dialogues. Now, his successor, Aristotle, is going to write what we tend to think of as more typical philosophical texts in which he sets out a thesis and defends that thesis or develops it. But Plato allows his philosophy to unfold in a series of conversations, which in fact is why the works of Plato are called the dialogues. Why is that? Well, it's for a couple of reasons. One is that for Plato, philosophical truth was not a matter of authority that has to be handed down from on high and then defended, but it arose in conversation, because not any one person had all truth, but one took a thesis and one tested it by trying it out with other people, listened to their objections to see whether the thesis survived or whether the thesis was modified by that kind of conversation. Another reason for the use of dialogue is that it grows out of the ancient Greek form of tragedy. Tragedies are also dialogues. If you open a Greek tragedy, you will see that essentially all it consists of is one character speaking and then another character responding and the first character responding to him, and so forth and so on. You have this alternation of conversation in the tragic form. And the tragic form is important because the tragic form, in the hands of its great practitioners Aeschylus and Sophocles, to a lesser extent Euripides, is about coming to understand the will of the gods for us. And therefore, and since that early exploration of the will of the gods and that early search after wisdom was cast in this dramatic form which entails dialogue, it's not a terrible, a far leap, I should say, from there to Plato's use of the dialogue form in his own philosophical writing. And so Walton is writing in a grand tradition, actually, when he is using the dialogue form to explore the nature of angling, but also to explore the goodness of God's creation, to explore the interaction between human beings and the nature around them, and so on. So this first thing to say about chapter 1 is that it begins the dialogue. One might say that inasmuch as it was an epistle to the reader, there is the introduction is a kind of dialogue as well, but at least we have a dialogue in the classic sense in chapter 1. And chapter 1, again, is all about a sort of concordia discourse. We have these three different figures. We have Piscator. Piscator in Latin means a fisher. That OR ending in Latin is the ER ending in English that shows an agent or a person who's doing something. And piscis in Latin is fish in English, as in the astrological sign Pisces. Piscis is a Latin pronunciation. So Piscator is fisher, Venator is hunter, and Auceps, one who uses falconry in order to hunt, uses birds to hunt, an ancient practice as well, and by the way, used in various parts of the world. I remember in Japan, people would talk about the use of cormorants in particular like I believe in Gifu Prefecture, where they tie long strings to birds' feet and then release the birds to go dive into the water after fish, and then they call the birds home by tugging on the strings, and then they manage to get the fish from the bird and so on. So it's, and by the way, I might point out that our famous Mississippi novelist William Faulkner, his name apparently originally meant one who uses falcons, that is, a falconer. And so, by the way, while we're talking about contemporary references of famous authors, I might give a parenthetical notice here that Izaak Walton himself, I notice, still has a life today beyond his book, and that is there's apparently an organization active even now called the Izaak Walton League, which equips every ordinary folk, equips them to go out and test streams in their area to determine the level of pollution, to see if these streams need to be cleared up, which, if we were to read Piscator as a kind of stand-in for Walton himself, would be entirely appropriate, because in Chapter 1, Piscator sings the praises of waters and of rivers and streams. But at any rate, Piscator gets the first word here, and we get from this dialogue that he has come upon, in this little drama, he has come upon these two other men who are out in the countryside on the way to participate in their own sports. First we're introduced to Venator the hunter, and then Auceps the falconer. And so as they're going in the same direction, they decide they're going to pass their time like the Canterbury Pilgrims in Chaucer. They're going to pass their time by discoursing each of them is going to give an apology, or each of them is going to give a defense of his own particular sport. And we might say here that in each of these defenses, we get an absolutely wonderful, delightful mixture. Talk about a Concordia discourse. We get a wonderful mixture of what we would call science, and science of various kinds. We get biology, we get geography, and so on, these various disciplines of understanding or analysis of nature. And we get that mixed with religious discussion, we get that mixed with history, we get that mixed with classical learning, and we get it mixed with philosophy. And I might point out, by the way, as we've mentioned before, that in the 17th century there is not the hard and fast distinction between philosophy and science as there tends to be in our own day. Philosophy tends to be viewed as a humanity, and the sciences not as humanities but as hard sciences. But going back to the very beginnings of the ancient Greek tradition with the pre-Socratic philosophers, we find that those philosophers devote much of their thinking to what we would call physics or cosmology, and so that carried on right on through until sometime we should say in the 19th century, when scientific knowledge had accumulated to a point that it was difficult to master any one branch of it, let alone a number of branches of sciences and also philosophy and so on. And so the Piscator invites the other gentlemen to begin talking about how they to defend their own sport, and so Auceps is going to begin. By the way, notice the kindness and humility of Piscator on the bottom of the left-hand column, page 226, as he says, let's see, if you take us anglers, what should we say? If you mean such simple men, when Venator says that he thinks that fishermen are a bit simple. They're not the smartest, most sophisticated people he's ever met, and that kind of humility is exemplified by Piscator in his response. If you mean such simple men as lived in those times when there were fewer lawyers, when men might have had a lordship safely conveyed to them in a piece of parchment no bigger than your hand, though several sheets will not do it safely in this wiser age, I say, sir, if you take us anglers to be such simple men as I have spoken of, then myself and those of my profession will be glad to be so understood. But if by simplicity, by simplicity you mean good nature, forthrightness, and honesty, where lawyers are not cheating one another and their clients and this kind of thing, yes, then I'm fully happy to be called simple as an angler. But if by simplicity you mean to express a general defect in those that profess and practice the excellent art of angling, I hope in time to disabuse you and make the contrary appear so evidently that if you will but have patience to hear me, that's there's some humility again. I shall remove all the anticipations that discourse or time or prejudice have possessed you with against that laudable ancient art, for I know it is worthy the knowledge and practice of a wise man. Right, so it's just delightful humor. He doesn't take offense. There's no anger here, but he's willing to teach if the other is willing to learn. And so Auceps then, in response to Piscator's invitation, Auceps begins this discourse. He's the first who has to leave, by the way, so he might well begin this section by talking in defense of using birds for hunting. And so Auceps, as all of them do, begins by talking about the element that he traffics in, that is the air, as the birds fly through the air and fly through the heavens. The air is an excellent element. And he talks about various kinds of birds, and he talks about how the eagle is a bird of prey that is closely associated with Jupiter himself, and talks about air as the essential element that everything needs to breathe in order to live, and without air everyone dies. And so his is, in some way, he deals with the most basic element of all. And he talks about various birds. He talks about in the Old Testament. He talks about how Noah used birds to determine whether or not the flood had come to an end. He talks about, in the right-hand column on page 227, about halfway down, or maybe a bit closer to the bottom, he talks about how the ravens fed the prophet Elijah, and so on. If he's talking about creatures of the air, he goes on to talk about the bee. The bee, by the way, is a very, very important creature in the grand tradition of literature. Because it's such a useful animal, it produces wax and it produces honey. Honey, of course, would be enormously important in any ancient European culture, because that was they didn't have access to sugar cane, and so anything sweet that one might enjoy typically came not from sugar but from honey. So it was important for that reason, but also, as I said, because it produces wax, produces artificial means of artificial light. And for this reason, beekeeping was enormously important, and it was a valued trade in ancient Rome, for instance. One of my favorite works, a work not entirely unlike the Compleat Angler, one of my favorite works from the classics, is Virgil's wonderful agricultural poem called the Georgics. The fourth book of the Georgics is devoted to beekeeping. So he talks about the bee as well. And then if you look on the left-hand column of page 228, he gives this long catalog of various excellent kinds of birds that he shares with us. And it's at that point then his discourse comes to an end, and Venator then begins his relatively short discourse about hunting. He talks about the element that he deals with is the earth, and the earth, of course, is important because it's fruitful and it provides us with the food that we need in order to survive, and so on. And then he talks about the use of animals, and he talks about hunting and the consumption of animals, and how hunting has been a noble sport going back to classical times. And Xenophon says that Cyrus, in the excellent educational work, the Cyropaedia, this work from classical Greece, that Cyrus was sort of this excellent example of the well-educated and well-rounded person, was very accomplished in the art of hunting and these kinds of things. And so you get this wonderful defense of hunting as well. And then finally it comes Piscator's time to defend his own sport of fishing, and he gets by far the largest discourse, and it really is a delightful thing. He talks about the element of water as being the primal and first. The Spirit of God, he reminds us, according to Genesis 1:2, was the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. So apparently before anything else in creation, there was water, and that anything that exists requires water in order to live, and so on. He goes on to, if we're talking about a wonderful mixture of science with this sort of philosophical and religious discourse. Towards the top of page 229, he gives us this wonderful paragraph, and it's a very nice specimen of the scientific prose of the second half of the 17th century. He talks about how you can take any kind of shrub, really, and put it in a pot. Before you do so, weigh the soil in the pot. Let's say the soil in the pot comes to exactly, I don't know, let's say it comes to exactly 10 pounds. All right. And then you make the shrub be a little sapling, right? So it's a small thing. Plant it and then water it, and it will grow through time. And let's say it becomes a big shrub, and let's say it becomes, I don't know, let's say it grows to a height of 3 feet and is filled with branches and leaves and so on. It's significantly larger than it was before by a factor of 6 or 7 times. Then if you were to uproot it and weigh the soil once again, you would find that the soil weighs more or less what it did before the plant began growing. And so this is a proof or a demonstration, according to Walton, that essentially the entire increase of the plant must have been due to the water that was added to the mixture over time, and so on. But it really is despite the accuracy or not of the scientific speculation there, what I mean to say is that paragraph, that discussion, is a pretty fair sample of scientific writing or scientific discourse in late 17th century England. Notice that towards the bottom of page 229, he gives us wonderful scriptural authority for the consumption of fish in the books of Leviticus and book of Deuteronomy about how much fish should be consumed. He goes on a bit later if we're talking about that kind of thing. A bit later, he talks, as we shall see, about how diet of fish is a particularly healthy diet. So there's a bit of medical writing tossed in, as we shall see. And then, let's see, among other things, he talks about, and notice, by the way, that his is not just a pure lecture that he's giving these others, but notice how much there is conversation in this discourse between Piscator and Venator. I mean, part of it is that Piscator is setting forth his views, but part of it is interactive with Venator, an interactive conversation. We see that on page 231, left-hand column, he talks about the antiquity of fishing. And notice that he mentions Deucalion's flood. The ancient Greeks and Romans also had a tradition of a universal flood, rather like Noah's flood, that was survived essentially by a person, so that the world was started again. You can read about this early in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and so Deucalion was the new person that was made from the flood. So Piscator refers to going all the way back essentially to the beginning of time. Adam apparently taught the art of fishing to his son Seth, and so on, and then again from Deucalion's flood in that paragraph, ending with a reference to Noah's flood. We find out, as he says, that Amos and Job both mention, the books of Amos and Job both mention fish hooks, and so apparently it was known. Angling was known, especially angling with a hook at the end of a line was apparently known in Old Testament times. And he's going to go on and give even more scriptural authority for using fishing, as we shall see. But before he does, on page 232 and 233, he gives a long discourse about waters, about various kinds of rivers and different types of rivers and their peculiarities, and he talks about how, and Aristotle describes a river which dances when music is played near the river, and all sorts of various oddities about rivers that disappear underground in one place and come out again of a different color in another place, and this kind of thing. We get a discussion of the Leviathan, the giant fish, and so on. We get a discussion of various types of odd fish in page 233. So again, this use of what we call natural sciences, scientific observation, in this case a kind of zoology here, where he talks about the cuttlefish or the squid that has an appendage that shoots out from its body that it uses to catch or fish for others. So it actually is itself is a kind of fisher. He talks about the hermit crab, which hides inside a shell, and so on. By the way, just a brief excursus on the top of page 234 about birds and how some birds will mate for life with only one other bird, and so on. We get references to the waters from the Book of Psalms on the right-hand column of page 234, and then in page 234 and 235, we finally get what one would expect, and that is all the discussion of Christ and the disciples. Many of the disciples were fishermen. Peter, James, John were fishermen, and he talks about the fact that these are the first disciples called, that these are the disciples that Christ distinguished by taking them up on the Mount of Transfiguration, that these are the disciples who are always mentioned first in any catalog of the disciples. So Christ seems to have a special place for fishermen, that they seem to be, these fishermen seem to be of a particular kind of character that is, that Christ finds useful among the most important of his early followers. And what else does he say here? He talks about the fact that after his resurrection, that Christ, when he tells Peter to cast his net on the other side of the boat, and Peter's net comes back full of fish. That's authority from Christ himself for fishing, and that Christ shares fish with the disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection, and so on. All of these are good biblical injunctions for the lawfulness, indeed the goodness of fishing. And then towards the end of his discourse, page 235 and page 236, you get this wonderful passage in which he talks about exemplary people that Piscator has known from the recent past, these 17th century figures, universally recognized as good and upstanding men, who, as it turned out, were fishermen as well, were anglers, and that made particularly good friends, stalwart friends. So he gives examples from his own day of how there's seems to be a conjunction between fishing and between a particularly sweet and dependable character. And he ends then with a couple of fun and interesting poems. And this discourse has been so persuasive that Venator has said that he, towards the end of chapter 1, that he wants to go with Piscator to the thatched house. This is the inn that Piscator is staying at as he's engaged on this fishing expedition. That Venator has become so convinced by the force of Piscator's defense of fishing that he himself wants to try. He's becoming a convert, shall we say. He's becoming a convert, as we will see in beginning with chapter 2. And the growing friendship between the two characters, Piscator and Venator, who were originally, back in chapter 1, going to pursue two different tasks, are now going to pursue the same task. Chapter 2 has much to say about the otter. We tend to think of otters as particularly cute, sweet, photogenic creatures, and there is much discussion of the otter in chapter 2 because Piscator is concerned with the otter. The otter apparently is a destructive animal, in that the otter competes with Piscator for fishing and can damage the habitat of the trout streams. And so Piscator does not like otters and wants to get rid of them. And also these various huntsmen so named huntsmen, not Venator particularly, but huntsmen, talk about wanting to get rid of the otter as well. The huntsman, for obvious reasons, is wanting to get the otter, no doubt, for its pelt. And so he is coming to trap otters. And so before we get down to the business of fishing, we've got to clear up the problem of the otter. And so Venator and the huntsman and Piscator then are present when the huntsman is killing a nest of otters. And I might say that down towards the bottom of page 238, bottom of the left-hand column, page 238, and top of page 239, we get what must be a violent scene. It's somewhat mitigated by the fact that we're in the middle of a dialogue. It's not directly described. We're in the middle of a dialogue, but you get a sense of what's going on here at the very bottom of the left column on page 238, where Venator says, "Merry, so he is, for look, he vents in the corner. Now, Ringwood has him." These are the names of hunting dogs, obviously. "Now he's gone again. He's bit the poor dog. Now Sweetlips has her. Hold her, Sweetlips. Now all the dogs have her. Some above and some underwater. Now, she's tired and past losing. Come, bring her to me, Sweetlips. Look, 'tis a bitch otter, and she has lately whelped. Let's go to the place where she is put down. Not far from it you will find all her young ones, I dare warrant you, and kill them all too." So this emphasis here on violence. Why the emphasis on violence in an otherwise very sweet, placid, peaceful work like the Compleat Angler? And I think we have a bit of an analog for this if we recall Ben Jonson's poem, somewhat pastoral as well, certainly set in the countryside, his poem To Penshurst. And I think the clue is that in both cases you have violence. In the case here of having to destroy the otter, in the case of To Penshurst, you have the necessity of hunting, and you have the game birds that are shot, and the fish that practically leap into the nets of the fishermen, and so on the Sydney estate in that poem. And I think the point is a recognition, a realistic recognition, that unfortunately violence, death, bloodshed is necessary for there to be any kind of life. That just as anything you eat is something that has died in order to give you life, so also it's just an inescapable fact that any kind of society, any kind of human society is going to be based to some extent on fighting against not only living with them, as is the case in most of the paragraphs of the Compleat Angler, but also occasionally having to counter them, as we see here. So perhaps that's why this emphasis on violence. And we get discussion not only, and by the way, I should say, even before, towards the top of the passage we read, towards the top of the left-hand column on page 238, yet another emphasis on what we call natural sciences, when Piscator poses the pleasant question, is the otter a beast or a fish? Are you hunting an animal or are you hunting a fish when you hunt the otter? And this is a question of taxonomy. The otter spends a lot of time in the water. Maybe it's a fish, and it has paddles which are almost like fins, so perhaps it's a fish, but then it's also a land animal as well, so perhaps it's a land animal. I mean, nowadays, of course, we think of it as a mammal. But at any rate, this taxonomical question there, which gives us which is another way of including the kind of scientific discourse here. And it's not just scientific discourse, but if you notice on the top of the left-hand column on page 239, we also get references to the law, that there are certain times when you may fish, and certain times when you should not fish. As you say, he that view the wise statutes made in the 13th year of Edward the First and the like in Richard the Second may see several provisions made against the destruction of fish, and so on and so on. So a close knowledge of the law, particularly as it pertains to matters having to do with pursuing game. And I should say also on page 239, left-hand column towards the bottom, we get religious discourse mixed again. And again, this emphasis on good-natured fun, that the Piscator tells Venator that he doesn't much care for the host of the inn. And now to your question concerning your host. To speak truly, he is not to me a good companion, for most of his conceits were either scripture jests or lascivious jests, for which I count no man witty. For the devil will help a man that way, inclined to the first, and his own corrupt nature, which he always carries with him to the latter. So there are ways in which you can talk, and there are pleasant exchanges one can have, and essentially the Compleat Angler is a good example of that are not inconsistent with good Christian practice. The host likes a cheap and dirty joke, and that's not consistent with Christianity according to Walton, and therefore it doesn't really partake the sort of sweet-tempered nature of this work. And so the chapter ends then with a discussion of the chub or the chubender fish, and how it's a lower grade fish than the trout, the kind of fish that one catches incidentally but typically doesn't go out searching to find, and usually considered of a lower quality. But Piscator points out that there is a certain way to dress it or to prepare this fish that makes it tasty, and he will talk about that. Towards the end of chapter 2, then, the final couple of paragraphs is the point where Venator sort of officially says, look, I would like to become a fisherman and I would like to be your student. And so we get the establishment then of this relationship between the master and the student. And it's an important relationship. It's an important relationship in Scripture where we have Christ and his disciples. And it's an important relationship as well in the classical world where we have something like Socrates and Alcibiades, the failed disciple, shall we say, of Socrates. But this notion that the master that the master imparts his knowledge in love to his student, and that the student gains this knowledge and then is going to also pass it on to others, and so on. And so we get the setting up of this tradition. And so Piscator takes Venator's hand, and the relationship between master and student then is sort of sealed in this handshake at the end of chapter 3. And from this point on, Venator often refers to Piscator as master, as teacher, as the disciples refer to Christ throughout the Gospels, we might say. And chapter 3 then talks about how, among other things, about how you can dress the chub. So we have discourse, sort of culinary discourse as well in this work. It's a work full of practical information, not only about how to fish, but then also how to clean the fish and how to prepare the fish to eat. And notice that by bottom of page 241, the left-hand column, after Piscator has told Venator how to fish and where to fish, which he does near the top of the left-hand column on page 241, then Piscator catches a chub, and then Venator, by imitating the example of Piscator, he also catches the fish and is absolutely delighted, as a fisherman always is with his first catch, near the bottom of page 241, delighted with the fish that he has caught. And so towards the bottom of left-hand column on page 241, top of the right-hand column, we get a discussion of various kinds of lures. Now, sometimes a worm or any kind of fly is the ant fly, the flesh fly, or the wall fly, or the door, or the beetle, which you may find under a cow turd or a bob, which you will find in the same place. In time will be a beetle. It's a short white worm, and like to and bigger than a gentle or cod worm or case worm. Any of these will do very well to fish with in such a manner. So discussion of lures here. And then a very nice nod to what we might call the train of charity. So just as in love or in charity, Piscator agrees to teach Venator, and so Venator then learns through the love of Piscator, learns a valuable skill. Then he takes his chub and asks Piscator what he should do with his chub. And Piscator says, well, we're going to give it to the poor so they'll have something to eat, and so on, that this chain of love, or this chain of charity, increases and multiplies. And then towards the end of the chapter, we get this discussion of how to dress fish and how to prepare them. And also in the last paragraph, you get this reference to Seneca talking about how important it was for the ancient Romans to preserve their fish as fresh as possible. In fact, sometimes after these fish were caught, they were kept in vessels filled with water that were brought into the consumer's house so that he could actually kill the fish on the moment of cooking it, keeping it fresh. Like we go to a high-end fish restaurant, they'll have the lobsters there alive in the tank so that the lobster will be completely, totally fresh when it's cooked and consumed. Chapter 4, then, as we're beginning to move towards the end of the Compleat Angler. Chapter 4 gives discussion about breeding of the trout, and goes into discussion of various kinds of, we should say, various species of trout that dominate in various parts of England. And this is probably in some way the most, the sort of purest scientific discourse that we get in the Compleat Angler, all this discussions of various varieties of trout and different breeds of them, and how they are to be maintained, and this type of thing. Notice, by the way, on the bottom of page 244, Venator is learning that it's more difficult to catch a trout, engaging in fly fishing, which is a particularly difficult skill to acquire, it's difficult to catch trout and to do it well. And then, as the chapter ends, we move into this, what we might call a kind of pure pastoral discourse. After the scientific discourse, then, as they have returned now to the inn for the evening, the evening's entertainment is singing, and Piscator recounts how he heard out in the countryside a couple of beautiful songs when he was out walking once upon a time. And one of these songs is Christopher Marlowe's Passionate Shepherd to His Love and Sir Walter Raleigh's Nymph's Reply. These are the pastoral poems par excellence in the English Renaissance tradition. Very fine poems they are, too. And so we have the milkmaid and her mother, who are both at the inn, that sing this song for the entertainment of the guests. And Piscator ends this singing of the song by saying, "Well sung, good woman, I thank you. I'll give you another dish of fish one of these days, and then beg another song of you. Come, scholar, let maudlin alone. Do not you offer to spoil her voice." And then time for dinner. And so chapter 5, we get then an introduction to Piscator's friend Peter, who also is a fisherman, and Peter's friend Corydon. By the way, Corydon is a name that comes straight out of Greek and Roman pastoral poetry. And so, in fact, I think, we also find it in English Renaissance poetry as well. You find him as a character in Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar, for instance, about 100 years, maybe 80 years or so before the Compleat Angler was written in the late 1500s. And so you get this wonderful conversation in chapter 5 between Peter, Piscator, Venator, and Corydon, talking about various kinds of fishing lore, and then each of them to make this a perfect pastoral book. Then, as I say, pastoral poetry in ancient Greece and Rome consisted of shepherds singing songs back and forth to one another. And so you find here at the end of chapter 5, you find these various poems here that are recited or sung, these various characters singing them one to another. An absolutely beautiful pastoral ending to this work. Towards the last couple of paragraphs, really sum up this work so nicely. In the penultimate paragraph, you get Piscator telling Venator, referring to the fact that they have set out rods with lines and bait on them that they have not actually been using themselves. They've been at a slight distance casting their lines, but they've also set up these lines that just stay in the water. And they're going to go back and check these lines. And it's an example, once again, of a sort of sweet usefulness. While they have been out enjoying the act of fishing, they have also sort of doubled their time by setting out these other lines and making good use of making good use of their time by sort of engaging in a kind of double catch, and says that he's often done this. And it's not his favorite form of fishing, but he's often done this and sometimes fallen asleep. It can be particularly pleasant to set out one of these lines and then you just sort of doze off and wake up later to see what's attached itself to the end of your line. And then ends with this wonderful paragraph, "I'll tell you, scholar," this is Piscator talking to Venator, once again cementing the friendship between the two and cementing the relationship between Piscator and Venator as the relationship of a teacher to a student. "I'll tell you, scholar, when I sat last on this primrose bank," so not only do they sit on a hill, but it's a hill covered with flowers, "and looked down on these meadows, I thought of them as Charles the Emperor did of the city of Florence," maybe the most beautiful city in Europe, proverbially speaking, that they were too pleasant to be looked on, but only on holidays. Yes, that this art of fishing that carries one out into the countryside, into the beauties of nature, is just about the finest thing that a person can engage in. And the fineness of that activity, the fineness of that recreation, its joys and delights, just wonderfully captured in this absolutely delightful work by Izaak Walton, The Compleat Angler.